Welcome in this follow-up video about the death or not of Hong Kong cinema. First, I would like to thank you for the good reactions that the video has gathered. I got a lot of interesting feedback. So far it is my most popular video and it's very appreciated. It's nice to see that if you try to bring an interesting subject and you really put some work behind it, you really try to answer it with a developed answer, that you will get some positive recognition for that, so I appreciate it. So let's go in the comment section, and first I will start with a comment made by Oli, who noticed that the scenario I was highlighting at the end of the video was very optimistic. And he's right, it is indeed the optimistic scenario. In reality, if you really look at it carefully, there are two potential scenarios for the future of the Hong Kong film industry. There is the optimistic one, which I have chosen to finish the video on, because I wanted to have something relatively optimistic. But there is another scenario, there is the pessimistic one, in which Hong Kong's film industry continues to be absorbed by the co-production mechanism, so absorbed by the mainland, and the purely local film industry becomes smaller and smaller, and that create obviously less film being produced and probably of even lower quality. So that's the pessimistic scenario. And when I did the video, when I actually worked on the video, there was no question of Article 23. I don't know if you're aware of what is Article 23. It's basically a law which is forced by the mainland on Hong Kong against any kind of secession, betrayal, a lot of very vague words which could potentially be used against any kind of dissent, any kind of critique made toward the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party. When I'm doing this video now, the law hasn't passed yet, but it's just a matter of 1 or 2 days. And so far we have no idea of what is exactly in the law. So we will discover it in a couple of days. So when this video will be online, we will probably know, what is in this anti-secession law. And the most likely effect of this law is that it's going to freeze even more the freedom of speech that Hong Kong has enjoyed fairly successfully so far since the handover. So in the video I was highlighting the fact that Hong Kong was still free of the mainland censorship, and the local film industry could use this as an opportunity to do films which would be impossible to be made in mainland. And one of the aspects I was putting forward was the possibility to do political films, and politic in the sense that goes against what the Chinese Communist Party want to promote, to do things which have a different point of view, which can be highly critical of the Chinese Communist Party, things which are impossible to do when you are in the mainland. And unfortunately, it's pretty sure that after the law has been passed, this possibility will be closed. As I said, the terms used in the law seems to be very vague, and they are done so on purpose. The idea, despite all the claim made by the one in charge in Hong Kong, all the pro-Beijing party and politicians, that it's going to target a very limited number of people, these kind of things, it's pretty sure that the idea is to kill any kind of dissent in Hong Kong. And so it will most likely succeed to that, and that means that any political films in Hong Kong will be impossible to be made. A film like 10 Years will most likely be impossible to produce in Hong Kong after the law has passed. So on that part, it's pretty much sure you won't be able to do anything political in Hong Kong after the law. It's a bit more unclear when it comes to other aspects which are censored in the mainland, like eroticism, like violence, like some aspect of fantasy, some elements of fantasy. We don't know if that will have an impact in Hong Kong. I think it will probably be something in between. It probably won't completely make the film produced in Hong Kong on the same model that what is in the mainland, but that will certainly reduce the intentions of filmmakers to do something out of the norm. They will probably try to push a little bit more when they are doing them in Hong Kong, but probably not that much, because anything can be considered by the mainland authority as going against their power, as going against their instructions. So you would put yourself at risk, and so that will probably limit this possibility. So basically, because of this Article 23, the optimistic scenario which I chose to highlight in the video is getting further and further. There is much more chance, and that's really unfortunate, but that's indeed how it is, there is much more chance that the pessimistic scenario will happen, with a greater integration in mainland China and the dilution of the Hong Kong spirit in the film industry. There was another interesting comment from Nekoala, who was wondering how filmmakers like An Hui and Edmond Pang Ho-chung were able to still make films in this environment. If you choose your subject carefully, and if you are ready to do a couple of compromises, you can do some co-productions, and you can do them mostly the way you want them. In the case of An Hui, for example, I think for Our Time Will Come, which was the film she did set in during the Second World War, the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong. This subject is not too difficult to get the approval from the mainland censorship, because you will show the Japanese in a bad way, you will show the Chinese as heroic, so there is basically not much they can criticize, not much they can go against if you choose a subject like this. And if you are ready to do it, I mean, if you are ready to do it as a co-production, then you have access to a huge budget. You are able to recreate the time period in a much better way than if you were doing it independently in Hong Kong with much less money. So it can be worth in this case. And as I said, there is a matter of your own degree of compromission. So to stay on the example of Our Time Will Come, the film shows only one resistance, and it's the communist resistance. This one was clearly made in order to please the censorship, because in reality there was indeed a very strong and active communist resistance during the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, but there was not the only one. There was also one from the Kuomintang, and there was also some which were supported by the Allied power and the former colonial power that was England. So they all did their share in order to fight the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong. But in Our Time Will Come, we only see the communist part and we don't see any of the others. It's certainly done on purpose. So if you are ready to put that aside, to put the parts which may not please so much the censorship, and concentrate on some aspects which you know are going to please the censorship, but not necessarily affecting too much the characters or the story you wanted to tell, then you can do co-production, and you can do the film probably close to 80 to 90% of what you had in mind originally. So it may be worth. I think in this case, Our Time Will Come was actually a pretty good film, so she probably was right to do it this way. The other option would have been not to do it at all, because I don't think she would have been able to finance it if she did it in Hong Kong only, with the limited budget that would have brought. That would probably have been impossible. So yeah, that can be understood. In the case of Pang Ho-chung, is doing another interesting way, which is basically balancing. It's a balancing act. So he would do one production as a co-production for the Chinese mainland market, and then he would do a film locally, like Misbehavior, the film he did for the Chinese New Year 2 years ago. This one was purely 100% Hong Kong production, made very fast, made on a very limited budget, but he wanted to do it because he wanted to have his freedom, because at the same time he's working on a big wuxia production, a co-production with the mainland, a really big budget, which requires a lot of care about the story and to make sure that he will get the finance and he will get the approval from the authority in order to do it. So it can lead to some kind of frustration and annoyance. And so his way of dealing with that is by keeping doing some films in Hong Kong sometimes on a much limited budget. And I think that's another way to do, which is pretty interesting. A few years ago, I did an interview with Gordon Chan, which basically said the same thing. I was asking him, because he was doing only co-production at that point, a co-production with mainland, and I asked him, why do you choose to still stay mostly in Hong Kong and not move to Beijing like some other Hong Kong filmmakers have done so far? And he said no, he needed to be able to come back to Hong Kong regularly, because if he stayed in mainland too long, he would become crazy. So that's a way to keep your mental health, I guess. Do a balancing act between the two. Now, once again, after the introduction of Article 23, would this balancing act still be that efficient? I'm not sure. We will see. Only time will tell. And that brings me to another comment which has been made by La Reine des Reins, who noticed that in films made by Benny Chan and Wong Jing, so in co-production with the mainland, those films still have quite some Hong Kong spirit to them. And he's right. Because when I said in the video that when you do a co-production, you are doing it for the mainland market and for with the Chinese government approval. That's true. But of course, there are different degrees of integration in this co-production. If you take, for example, The Climbers by Daniel Lee, not Daniel Lee. If you take The Climbers by Daniel Lee, clearly this film is made for the Chinese market. It's not, there is not much Hong Kong identity to it. Maybe you can say the over dramatic aspect of the obstacles that the climbers are facing are a bit more Hong Kong style, but at 80-90% the film is basically a mainland film. I would say the same for a film like The Captain, the catastrophe film made by Andrew Lowe. It's 80-90% a mainland production, even if it's a co-production technically. Still, there are some filmmakers who try to keep the Hong Kong spirit in their films, despite having to face with all the constraints that a co-production bring. For example, that was the case of Chin Carlock's Golden Job. Golden Job was actually very reminiscent of the big action comedy film dealing with brotherhood made by Hong Kong in the 80s and 90s. So there are some filmmakers who try to keep this spirit, and Benny Chan is one of them, with White Storm, for example. White Storm is actually very close to what would be a classic Hong Kong film production. I find it also in Project Gutenberg recently. And amongst them, Wong Jing is indeed one of the filmmakers who try to keep this spirit alive. And that's a bit surprising, because Wong Jing is known to be a filmmaker who completely embraces the commercial aspects. He has no artistic aspiration, at least that's what he says. So you would believe that he would have completely embraced the co-production aspect, because that's where the money is. But while he is now doing only co-productions, his films are actually still very close to what he was doing before. they have more money, they follow some of the regulations put in place by the Chinese government. But I would say in the big margin at 70%, 80%, they are mostly with this Hong Kong spirit of a bit of craziness, of mixing genre, this kind of characteristics. I already noticed when, if you have been able to read my book, which unfortunately is possible only for the one who read French, I noticed in the book that Wong Jing seems to have a real love for Hong Kong during the 60s. That was one of the time period he was always coming back, producing films set in this time. And he did it again with Chasing the Dragon recently. So I do think that Wong Jing is indeed very attached to the Hong Kong spirit of filmmaking and tries to keep it in his production. Once again, that's really surprising. He is aware that if he wants to do the film he wants to make, he has no other choice. He has to deal with co-production. He has to deal with the Chinese government. And I think that shows in his political stance. Actually, for a long time, Wong Jing was rather pro-democracy. He made some declarations which were in general pro-democracy. And a few years ago, he did a 180 degree, and he started to put some statements about supporting the government, supporting the Chinese central government, all these kind of things, the pro-Beijing party and stuff. And so that happened just like that, and I'm pretty sure that he did it in order to make sure that his films would be co-produced with the mainland, that he would have access to that. So is he really sincere about this position? That remains that's an open question which I don't have a clear answer. I have my doubt about it personally, but if you want to do films with big budget, you have no choice. And in the case of Wong Jing, I mean, his films are based on star power for the most part, so he needs to have access to big stars. He needs to be able to pay them what they ask for, and that requires big budget, so that requires a co-production system. So he does what he has to do, but at least his films still have, for the most part, a Hong Kong spirit to them. Another filmmaker who managed to keep for a good part of the Hong Kong spirit is Herman Yeo. Even his co-production managed to keep a real Hong Kong sensibility to it. I don't know if he will be able to keep doing them like this. And there are some compromises in these films too, but for the most part they look like what Hong Kong would have been able to produce if they had kept their industry from the 80s, 90s vibrant in the two following decades. And lastly, there was a comment from Monkey Kung Fu. Monkey Kung Fu would say that indeed, who agreed with my conclusion that is Hong Kong cinema as we knew it and as we loved it is dead, but there is a new Hong Kong cinema. He agrees with this statement, but he was highlighting the fact that there are a lot of good films to be discovered from the 70s, 80s and 90s. And he's right. I mean, if you do an average, I guess, during those 3 decades, you have probably over 100 films being produced each year. And that means there are a lot to watch, and a lot of them, fortunately, are still available one way or another, sometimes in a less than perfect quality, but you are still able to access them if you want. And so if you are sad about the current state of Hong Kong cinema, which is perfectly understandable and which I share, then you can always go back to the classics. You can always dig into all these films which have been made during those 30 years when Hong Kong cinema was in its golden age. There are a lot of very good films to discover. There are a lot which are not necessarily talked about. I try to highlight quite a few in my book, but of course there are still many more. So you can always get back this dose of energy, of creativity. What made Hong Kong cinema so successful back then, you can still find it back in the films which were produced back then, and still be able to appreciate what has been done. That's it. It's finished for this little follow-up on Is Hong Kong Cinema Dead? I will see you back in 1 or 2 weeks, as usual, with another video which will deal with a completely different subject. That's a subject which is not necessarily talked about much into the Asian cinema film community, but I hope you will find it interesting. Until then, keep watching Hong Kong films, even be them from the old times or the new or the recent years. All the support you can give to the industry is welcome. All the support you can give to Hong Kong itself is welcome, because the city really needs it right now. And by extension, all the support you can give to this channel will be also welcome. So I will see you soon in a matter of 1 month in the follow-up video of the next video. See you.